What is the most important transitional moment in your life?
Or are there several?
What landscape speaks really strongly to your heart and makes you come alive?
I'm David Denny,
And I'm Tessa Bilecki.
and this is Fire and Light.
Conversations about life, love, and soul.
It's August. It's a very hot month here in the Sonoran Desert. It's also a very special time of year for Tessa, right, Tessa?
Oh, it is. Welcome, everyone. August is the month of the most important transitional moment in my life. 57 years ago, 57, on August 17th, 1967, I arrived in Sedona, Arizona, to join Father William McNamara and the Spiritual Life Institute, and my life changed forever for lots of reasons.
I look forward to hearing more about that.
Yeah.
I know our family moved from the Midwest, from Indiana to Arizona in 1969. So 2 years later, I was going to Scottsdale High School, and I remember traveling up to Sedona. I had no idea you existed or the Spiritual Life Institute existed, but I remember just being swept off my feet by the landscape of the Red Rock country there in Sedona.
Yeah. So it's interesting that we both moved from very different landscapes, from wet, green, lush, verdant landscapes, you from the Midwest, I from New England. And for both of us, it was love at first sight moving to the desert.
Yeah, you were struck particularly deeply because it really set the course of the rest of your life. It was like a seed got planted or a flame got kindled in you, and a real space kind of opened up and it set you off on a very different trajectory than you expected.
I had majored in Russian in college and minored in French. And I was dreaming about working for the United Nations. I remember this would have been the height of the Cold War. I wanted to make a difference diplomatically, internationally, in a small way by being part of the UN. And then I end up, going to Sedona. That'll unpack a little bit more. That's why we're asking all of you this question. Is there a transitional moment in your life where you may have been headed in one direction and then it shifts and something else happens? What was it that happened? Where was it that it happened for you? And what was that like? Now, for me, I think so. Yes, there was that encounter with the desert. Beyond desert, I think what first really struck me was the reality of the wilderness. When you grow up in the East the way I did, or the Midwest the way you did, Dave, you can't see the horizon because there are so many trees. The land is flatter. So, what got me, first of all, was the size of the landscape, the wildness of the landscape, and how far you could see, how much sky you could see. So many people call the West big sky country. I was just so full of wonder at all of this. I didn't realize what an effect it was having on what I like to call my soulscape. It's taken me years to realize that where we live, the landscape where we live, is affecting us on the inside. It's affecting who we become. It affects how we think. It affects who we are. So I love that juxtaposition of landscape and soulscape. And that's really what we want you to be thinking about through this podcast and throughout this next month.
I remember how shocked I was at the contrast between the damp spring of Indiana and all the hardwood forests. And then I remember one of my first adventures when I came to Arizona was floating down the Salt River on an inner tube and lying back, freezing on the backside because the water was cold, and baking on the top side in
Yeah.
weather that was maybe 100 degrees. And I was looking up at red rock cliffs and saguaro cacti growing on those cliffs. And I thought, wow, this is different.
You always love to talk about the difference in March.
Oh,
What
my
what
goodness.
March was like growing up and then what it was
Yeah.
like when you came to Arizona.
Yeah. For those of you who have lived in the East or the Midwest, for me, March was like hell on earth. Winter would not let go, would not let go. And then we would get just slush and those wet, heavy snows. And sometimes you get those ice storms, which were beautiful, but deadly for the trees. I remember ice skating down the middle of the street one time. It made it a little less hellish. That was fun. But yeah, March was just terrible, I thought. And you get depressed, and the sun wouldn't show for days and days. Then I moved to Arizona, and March was like heaven on earth.
Yeah.
It was just the mildest, most beautiful month, and I've never gotten over it.
Yeah, so landscape, the importance of it in the unfolding of our spirituality. So for me, moving to Sedona was the beginning of my contemplative life. I don't want to be esoteric about that. I really mean a more reflective life
Mhm.
where everything that I was doing was more mindful, more reflective. As Socrates said, the unexamined life is not worth living. I like to kind of retranslate that as the unreflective life is not worth living. But it also was, for me, that was connected to a very strong immersion in the earth. So I learned how to garden in Sedona. I learned how to can and freeze vegetables. Our garden was fabulous, remember. It took
I
us
do.
years to transform it from this hard clay that would not absorb water. So every spring we had to add mulch and compost and turn over the soil and aerate it and make it ready for those seeds and ready to receive the water. So it was a huge amount of work and so rewarding because that garden was fabulous. And we ate all that stuff. So not only did I learn how to garden, but I learned how to cook for a crowd.
People might not remember or realize that you were really working at a retreat center, really.
Yes. So we were not just a burgeoning contemplative community, but it was a contemplative retreat center where people came and stayed in individual hermitages on retreat.
Mhm.
So yeah, I had done a little cooking in my apartment the year after college, but boy, here I was cooking for 15 and eventually as many as 20 people at a time. So this was this was a whole other thing. There was a tremendous amount of work in those early years. And the house that I lived in, the so-called hermitage I was living in, was a public place. It was our kitchen, it was our dining room, it was the library, it was the office, it was the community room where we all hung out when we did spend time together.
And what would you say about the architecture itself?
Oh, well, this was, oh my gosh. You know, the place got torn down when we had to sell it. It's one of the saddest things. I've actually never gotten over it. I still call Sedona the homeland of my heart.
And it might be important to say, too, that, see, when you were there in the 1960s, Sedona was not developed the way it is now. So many people who see it today might wonder, well, what are they talking about wilderness?
Yes, that's true. I was there from 67 until 1983. And everything changed in '83. Sedona got discovered, and now it's this crowded, very commercialized place where to go hiking, you need a permit. You need reservations. Sometimes you have to get on a shuttle to go to a trailhead. I mean, that was unheard of in the years that I lived there. When we were there, nobody knew about it. It was only 5 or 6,000 people, and you could hike and wander anywhere you wanted, and you didn't have to ask anybody permission to go there. And when you went, you never ran into anybody. It was a dream.
So instead of a fancy apartment, you were living in a pretty primitive homestead.
Yes, it was an old ranch. It was a place that had been homesteaded in the early 1920s. And all the buildings looked like they had just grown up out of the ground.
Mm.
The earth was red, and all the buildings, and they were all these tiny little things, were made out of red rock. A lot of them were very primitive, and David Levin, who is recording this, lived in what had been a root cellar. Dave, you lived at the edge. There was an old blacksmith shop, and there was a tiny little room attached to it that some people said had been a granary originally. I don't know about that.
It was like a big closet.
Yeah, it was like a big closet.
I lived in there. It had just a little bookshelf, I think, and I slept on the floor, and there was a tiny wood stove, which now sits on my porch here in Tucson.
Yeah, I just love that we have that piece of our history on your patio. So most of the buildings were red rock, but the house where I lived was made out of yellow coconino sandstone as opposed to the red coconino sandstone. It had a tin roof so that when it rained, the sound of the rain on that tin roof was, very special. I have 3 of those stones, those hand-hewn stones, out on my patio here in Tucson. This history is very, very important to me. And the question for all of you listening is, so what memories do you have of these places in your life where something special happened to you that still has an impact on your life? Do you have memorabilia or treasures that you gathered there as a memory of, or a touchstone that connects you back and keeps alive that magical unfolding transition in your life? Everything about living in Sedona was just such an awakening for me, just such a huge, exciting adventure. It was like I was living all my childhood fantasies of, watching those 1950s cowboy, all those westerns on TV. And here I was living in that kind of a landscape. One of the things that really got to me was the moon. I felt like I had never seen the moon before until I moved to Sedona. Again, when you live in the East or the Midwest and there are so many trees, a moonrise is obscured. And by the time the moon comes up above the trees, it's very small, pale, and you often are seeing it filtered through the trees. And in Sedona, it wasn't like that at all. It just came up so big and so huge. I could not get over the size of it, first of all. And there was a special place I used to go, a rock I would sit on, facing east, facing Wild Horse Mesa. That was another thing I loved about living there, was the wildness of the names, the colorful names. So, Horse Thief Basin, Wild Horse Mesa, Bumblebee Ranch, Cave Creek, all these evocative Western place names. Anyway, I'm sitting on that rock watching the moon rise, and I made a special ritual of it. On the full moon night, I would be there for the moonrise. It's a big part of my spiritual practice to this day, is paying attention to the moonrise. But the other thing that got me about it was how bright it was.
It's like a light.
Yeah, it is like suddenly a floodlight comes on. I couldn't get over. I remember the first time I realized that the moon cast a shadow. I could see my shadow in the moonlight. And I started very quietly, privately, calling myself Moon Shadow. That kind of became my indigenous name. And then it was after that that Cat Stevens wrote his famous song, Moon Shadow. I'm being followed by a moon shadow. So I loved that song because I had experienced it. It meant so much to me, those moonrises and moon shadows in Sedona.
But your life there, beautiful as it was, working with the earth and walking in the moon shadows, was you also had quite an intellectual life, didn't you?
Yes, that's important too. So I said this was the beginning of my contemplative life. When we say contemplative life or reflective life, we're talking about a mindful life. We're talking about a life in tune with the sacred, in tune with the divine, in touch with God, whatever language you use for that sacred dimension. Prayer, of course, meditation are very important practices. Reading is pivotal. And some of the most important books of my life I read then, books that are still important to me, and not always spiritual books. And this is important. Sure, I read Thomas Merton. I read Carmelite spirituality. I read The Fathers and Mothers of the Desert. But perhaps the most important books were not spiritual books. So I read The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. And that was connecting to what I was experiencing living in the wilderness, because remember the figure of the lion, Aslan, is the Christ figure for C.S. Lewis's allegory in the
Mhm.
Chronicles. And the theme that keeps repeating through all of those chronicles is Aslan is not a tame lion. And that's what I was experiencing. I was experiencing that wildness, that untamedness in the landscape. And here I am reading about how God, Aslan, is not a tame lion. I read Wind, Sand, and Stars by Saint Exupéry, and about his flying across the vast deserts of North Africa, actually crashing in the desert and being lost in the desert and rescued by Bedouins. That had a big
He
impact
also
on me.
wrote The Little Prince, didn't he?
He did write The Little
Hmm.
Prince.
So many people are familiar with that book.
Yeah, they're more familiar with The Little Prince. And that's a great book about wonder, which is a pivotal part of contemplative life, is waking up to wonder. How about you? Now, what were you reading in Sedona, or what were your original inspirations?
Well, I also, actually, before I got to Sedona, I had read Thomas Merton's Seven Story Mountain. But the other thing that struck me about Merton, that in reading other of his works, which then happened when I got to Sedona, was that he was very socially conscious. He was very
Mhm.
involved with people like Thich Nhat Hanh and the anti-war movement. He was also, around the time Dr. King was assassinated, Merton had arranged for him to come to speak to the monks. He was very involved with the civil rights movement as well. And that really struck me, that here's a person sort of living in the desert, living off the grid as a monk, and yet was thinking very deeply about what was going on in his culture, not isolated from it, and offering a kind of outlook, a wisdom, a depth that I thought was wonderful. So Merton was big. Interreligious dialogue was very big. I had had exposure to Buddhist meditation and some training in that. And so I was thrilled to discover people like Merton, for example, who had dialogued with Buddhists, especially. Then there was another priest, a Benedictine English priest named Bede Griffiths, whom I loved because he, in the 1950s, went to India and set up an ashram and was very involved in dialogue between Christian and Hindu, as well as Buddhist traditions in India, and saw these traditions as on an equal standing,
Yeah.
which was really refreshing for me. That, of course, is a big departure, a big shift in Christian spirituality. We used to be more triumphalistic and that idea of Christian supremacy. But
Yeah,
I think
thank
now
goodness we've moved away from that.
there's more of a sense now that each culture encounters the ultimate, the divine, and we all speak different languages. And the way we speak about it's going to be a little different, and it can be very mutually enriching and cross-fertilizing. So those were themes that struck me right from the beginning when I
Yeah.
entered the monastery.
And
But I was also discovering just basic, like Roman Catholic stuff about the liturgy, the Mass. And I loved that because I hadn't really grown up with that. I think I also was coming into it having lived briefly in Afghanistan and in Mexico, and with encounter with these other cultures. And then I realized, well, I'm not sure I know enough about my own. Although I grew up Protestant culture, of course, the Catholic culture goes back even farther into the roots of Western civilization. So that was interesting to find out about people like St. Augustine, for example.
yeah, and you use that word cross-fertilization. That's a
Yeah,
very important word for you as opposed to
contamination.
contamination. Yeah, because so many people feel that encountering the other, encountering differences means contamination, and I love how you have always emphasized the cross-fertilization of it. So, this was reflected in what our monastic rhythm of prayer was like. So,
Yeah.
talk about what readings did we use when we went to prayer as a community?
Yeah, we had developed our own book of prayers that we would use when we would go. So, for example, morning prayer is called lauds in the Catholic Christian tradition. So you go to lauds in the morning. In a typical monastery, you'd be hearing Christian or Jewish scripture, but sometimes we would read, say, a hadith from the life of Muhammad, or we would read something from the Vedas, the Hindu
The
Vedas,
Bhagavad
the
Gita,
Bhagavad Gita we read from. And so these were
Zen
mhm.
stories,
So
Sufi
we
stories.
were being formed by this kind of multicultural, multilingual, multi-religious spirituality, which to me was just really wonderful.
And so our question again to our those of you who are listening, what books
Hmm.
have been pivotal for you in your life? Do you need to go back and look at those again? Do you need to think about those original themes
Hmm.
that inspired you? And how would you be interacting with those themes or those books again? Who were the important people who influenced your life? What were the most important spiritual practices that you began to use? And how have those either continued or changed over the years? I know one of the most important lessons I learned in those first years was one of the most important practices I was assigned by Father William as my spiritual teacher, my root teacher at the time, was to write at least a page every day. And that's where my love of writing began. That's where my discipline of writing began,
Hmm.
was that writing just a page a day. And then it became so intoxicating. I felt so in love with it that I wrote much more than a page after a while. And I think the important thing, again, to emphasize to those of you who are listening, is now Dave and I are both writing memoirs. You don't have to write a memoir to reflect on your life, to reflect on your story. You could just be writing letters or isolated individual stories for your children or your grandchildren that you want to make sure that they remember. You
Hmm.
know, what is it that you want to be remembered for? What do you want to pass on to your children or your grandchildren or your friends or your colleagues? This is a very important part of life, organizing your photos so that you can sit and look at photos and tell stories. And, as we lose our memories as we age, a good thing to have all this ready to remind us of who we were and what our lives were like. Before we do our meditation and talk a little bit about the practice for this month, we also want to tell you the big news that we are moving not far. We both live as urban hermits in apartments in Tucson, Arizona. And the apartment next door to me that I have been dreaming about moving into for over 6 years has finally opened up. It's a bigger apartment so that I have more space to spread out archives. I'm still working on all these archives for the Norland Library at the University of Colorado Boulder, that they're taking my archives. What a blessing. I'm moving into that apartment, and then Dave, who has been living downstairs in the apartment just underneath me, we call ourselves, what do you call us, Dave?
Next floor neighbors.
Next floor neighbors. Well, Dave will then move upstairs into the apartment where I live, where we are recording this. So then we're going to become
Next door neighbors.
next door neighbors.
And I get out of Dave's cave.
And you get out of the cave at long last. And what will you see?
I will finally get to see sky and horizon.
Instead of
carports and cars.
So not only are we excited about it's going to be a whole new beginning for us, and it's really going to enhance not only our contemplative lives, but our writing lives, our lives of service to you. But we're going to be very busy for the next couple of months, packing up not just one apartment and my moving, but then after I'm done, then we have to do it all over again with Dave. So we won't do a podcast for the month of September, but we will be with you again for the month of October. So our meditation now for this month is going to be on the relationship between landscape and soulscape, what transitional pivotal moments sent us off on our life's adventure. But before we do the meditation, Dave, set us up.
Well, find a comfortable position, probably sitting with your back straight and with your chest open so you can breathe. And set aside any concerns or anxieties you may have.
Like about packing.
That's right.
And lists of where the furniture is going to move to.
All of those to-do list elements, plus other concerns you may have in your life. Set those aside.
And let's think about landscape, soulscape, earth, air, fire, water.
Recall a time, and especially a place, where a seed was planted, a flame kindled, a space opened, that changed your life, that set you on a new course.
Were you a child? Adolescent? Middle-aged? Solitary? With someone? Where were you?
What season was it? Summer green, autumn gold red, winter black, white, frost and snow, spring thaw and first blossoms.
Were you on flat land? In a forest? On a mountain?
What was the air like? Still, windy, clear, misty, cloudy and gray, starlight, moonlight? What fragrance comes to mind?
What did you hear?
Did the sun blaze or a candle glow? A campfire or wood stove crackle?
Were you on water or the shore? On a river or by a spring? Was it raining?
Were you indoors, at a window, with a book, with an image, in a place of worship?
Rest there a while. What has become of the seed, the flame, the opening?
Can you give it a name?
Has it sent out roots and leaves? Has the fire grown? The space expanded?
If the moment lies dormant, how might you make it quicken and thrive? Dream it into being.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you for listening. If you want to learn more, check out our websites, tessabalecki.com.
And sandandsky.org.
Share this podcast with your friends.
And if you can make a donation, push that donate button at sandandsky.org.
Thank you for listening. This has been Fire and Light.
Conversations on life, love, and soul.
The background music for Fire and Light is The Day We Met, composed and performed by Ricky Zhao.
Fire and Light's theme music is Dreamcatcher, composed and performed by Chris Martin and Jeff Harvey at Purple Planet Music.
Fire and Light is recorded in Tucson, Arizona, editing by David Levin.